What if the earliest kings of Earth never claimed to have built civilization, but only to have received it? Beneath the desert wind that scrapes across southern Iraq, where the Euphrates once divided into channels now buried under centuries of dust, clay tablets still preserve something older than empire. Each ununiform wedge pressed into wet earth more than 4,000 years ago carries a memory that contradicts everything we assume about human beginnings. Records not of creation but of continuation, not of triumph but of transfer, not of founders but of inheritors stepping into a world already measured, already governed, already complete. Before we go further into this quiet unsettling of history, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you find yourself drawn to evidence that reshapes what we think we know about our own past. And if you're still listening as night deepens or morning breaks, wherever you are, leave a comment telling me your location and the time. I want to imagine this question spreading across the world while most of it sleeps. Who built the world before we did? The story begins not with mythology, but with excavation. In the winter of 1849, British archaeologist Austen Henry Leard stood among the collapsed brick and fire-scorched timber of ancient Nineveh's royal library. The Assyrian capital had burned 25 centuries earlier, and the heat had baked thousands of clay tablets into an accidental archive, preserving what would otherwise have crumbled to dust. Among the administrative records and royal annals, Leard's workers uncovered fragments of a document that made no sense within the timeline scholars had constructed for human history. It was a list, nothing more. No poetry, no prayers, no mythological drama, just names, cities, and numbers recorded in the same bureaucratic tone scribes used to count grain shipments and livestock inventories. They called it the Sumerian king list, and it opened with 8 words that have never been adequately explained. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Not created, not claimed, not earned through conquest or divine right, descended. The text didn't describe the first human king seizing power or building thrones from nothing. It described them receiving an office that already existed, passed down from rulers whose reigns were recorded with the same clinical precision used for tax records, but whose durations stretched across impossible spans of time. 43,200 years for one king, 36,000 years for another, 28,800 years for a third. For more than a century, scholars have tried to dismiss these numbers as symbolic exaggeration, as scribal mistakes, as mythological inflation designed to glorify ancient rulers. But the scribes who copied this list across generations did not treat these figures as mythology. They recorded them in exactly the same grammatical structure, the same accounting format, the same matter-of-fact tone they used when documenting temple offerings and land boundaries. No explanatory commentary, no divine embellishment, no narrative justification, just data preserved as though the numbers themselves were factual records copied from archives the scribes believed to be accurate. And then the flood, the king list marks it explicitly, a clean dividing line separating one age of the world from another. 5 cities ruled before the waters rose, 8 kings with impossible lifespans governing an ordered, continuous world, then catastrophe, then silence, then resumption. After the flood, kingship returned, but everything had changed. Post-flood rulers lived mortal lifespans, decades, not millennia. The tone shifted from cosmic administration to human governance. Cities were rebuilt, but they were rebuilt by people who understood themselves not as pioneers, but as restorers. Something vast and structured had ended, and humanity had inherited what remained. When archaeologists excavated the cities named in the king list, Eridu, Shuruppak, Ur, Kish, they found something that should not exist if the flood were merely symbolic. Physical evidence of catastrophic flooding around 2900 BC. Clean layers of water deposited silt interrupting continuous settlement debris. Rebuilding efforts stacked directly at top older foundations. Irrigation channels recut along previous alignments. The flood was not literary convenience. It was stratigraphy. It was measurable, datable, physical fact. But here is where silence begins to carry weight. The cities that rose after the flood weren't primitive restarts. They did not rebuild civilization from scratch through trial and error. They carried forward advanced irrigation networks requiring complex engineering. They oriented temples according to astronomical alignments already calculated. They used base 60 mathematics, the same system that still governs how we measure time and angles today. and writing appeared not as clumsy pictographs struggling toward coherence, but as a fully formed script capable of recording legal contracts, medical procedures, and planetary movements with precision. In the temple archives at Nippur, excavators uncovered foundation tablets describing the reconstruction of sacred buildings. Beneath the dedicatory inscriptions, one phrase appeared again and again, a phrase that changes the entire framework of what we call the birth of civilization. This is the restoration of what was before, not foundation, not innovation, restoration. The word assumes memory. It assumes templates. It assumes that the people building these cities believed they were not inventing order for the first time. They were recovering it. Hold that thought for a moment. Imagine you're a scribe in the city of Uruk, 3,000 years before the Common Era. You sit in the shadow of a ziggurat that rises in stepped platforms toward the sky, its geometry so precise that its angles align with the solstices. You press a reed stylus into soft clay, recording a king's decree. But your training did not come from experimentation. It came from copying older tablets which were themselves copied from tablets older. Still, your calendar divides the year into lunar cycles calculated with mathematical accuracy. Your medical text describes surgical techniques. Your astronomical records predict eclipses. And when you ask your teachers where this knowledge originated, they do not tell you it was discovered. They tell you it was inherited, passed down from rulers whose names appear at the beginning of every chronology. Rulers who were not human but who governed as administrators, judges, and organizers of earthly systems. The texts name them Anu, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag. In the earliest Sumerian sources before later mythology wrapped them in divine abstraction. These beings are not described as distant creators dwelling in cosmic temples. They are described with the language of governance. They allocate cities like jurisdictions. They regulate water distribution. They establish legal precedents. They measure celestial cycles and assign their observation to priestly orders. The Anunnaki in these early administrative records do not perform miracles. They do not demand worship. They oversee, they regulate, they organize, and then after the flood they are simply absent, not overthrown, not destroyed in celestial war, not banished by moral judgment, just gone, and humanity continues alone, guided only by the memory of an order they believe was not originally theirs to design. This is not the story of gods as we imagine gods. This is the story of inheritance, of civilizations that never claimed to be first, but only to be what survived, of knowledge preserved not because it was invented, but because losing it was considered the greatest catastrophe imaginable. From Sumer to Egypt, from the Indus Valley to Mesoamerica, the earliest cultures describe the same structural pattern: an age of non-human governance, a catastrophic division, and humanity rebuilding in the aftermath. The names change, the details shift, but the memory of succession remains constant. Which brings us to the question that hums beneath every wedge of ununiform text, every flood layer, every rebuilt temple. If humans did not invent civilization, who did the ancients believe ruled before them? The answer begins in a museum basement in Istanbul, where a clay prism no larger than a wine bottle sits behind reinforced glass. It was discovered in 196 by German archaeologist Hermann Hiltrecht, buried beneath the collapsed remains of Nippur's temple library. The prism's four sides contain 18 columns of ununiform script, a complete version of the Sumerian king list copied around 2001-100 BC from sources the scribe himself described as ancient writings. When Hilrecht first translated the open section, he reportedly sat in silence, unsure whether he had made an error in reading because the text did not describe the beginning of human rule. It described its resumption. Before listing kings with recognizable reign lengths, 23 years, 18 years, 36 years, the scribe recorded something else entirely. 5 cities, 8 rulers, reign lengths stretching across epochs so vast they defy human comprehension, and every one of them governed before the flood that divided the world in two. The first name on that list ruled for 43,200 years. His city was Eridu, and according to every text that mentions him, he did not build his throne. He inherited it from heaven. His name was Alulim. The tablet does not describe him as a conqueror. It does not celebrate his wisdom or recount his deeds. It simply states that he ruled, and for how long and in which city. The next king, Alalgar, ruled for 36,000 years, then Enluana 43,200 years. The pattern continues without variation, without narrative, without justification. This is not how myths are written. Myths explain, they dramatize, they provide reasons for why gods chose mortals or why power transferred between realms. But the Sumerian king list does neither. It records succession the way a ledger records transactions, impersonally, methodically, as though copying data from an older archive no longer questioned. The word translated as descended is kala, a term used elsewhere in Sumerian administrative texts to describe the transfer of goods, the allocation of land, the movement of resources from one authority to another. It is a bureaucratic verb, not a mythological one. Kingship was not invented in Eridu, it was received there. Meanwhile, beneath the soil of southern Iraq, archaeologists have traced Eridu's foundations back to approximately 5400 BC, making it one of the oldest continuously inhabited sites in Mesopotamia. Beneath its final temple platform lie 17 earlier temples, each built directly atop the ruins of the one before, preserving the same orientation, the same sacred geometry, the same footprint, continuity, repetition, restoration. But then the numbers change. The king list records the flood with a single clinical sentence. The flood swept over. After it, kingship resumes in the city of Kish. The first post-flood king, Gur, rules for 200 years. Still impossible by modern standards, but a fraction of what came before. Within a few generations, reign lengths drop to centuries, then decades, then lifespans archaeologists can verify against other records. Something fundamental had shifted. The system continued, but its administrators had changed. If kingship already existed before humans ruled it, who or what was ruling first? The pre-flood world, according to the king list, was governed by 8 rulers across 5 cities over a span of 241 to 200 years. No wars are mentioned, no famines, no successions through violence or betrayal. Just 8 names, 5 locations, and durations so vast they seem to belong to geological time rather than political history. Yet the scribe recorded them with the same grammatical structure used for every king who came after name, city, duration. As though the difference between ruling for 43,000 years and ruling for 23 years was merely a matter of record, not category. The cities themselves follow a pattern. Eridu I sits at the southern edge of the Mesopotamian floodplain where fresh water meets salt marsh. Bad Tabira lies to the north. Then Lara, then Chipper and Shurapak. Each city mentioned in the king list has been excavated. Each one shows evidence of settlement layers extending back to the 6th millennium BC. And each one was rebuilt after the flood on the same site, using the same orientations as though the locations themselves carried authority that survived catastrophe. What is absent from these early sections is as striking as what is present. There are no myths of creation, no tales of heroism, no moral lessons or divine interventions. The pre-flood kings do not slay monsters or receive commandments. They simply rule in sequence for durations that defy human biology, but are recorded as matter-of-fact administration. This pattern appears elsewhere in Egypt. The Turin king list, a papyrus fragment dating to the 13th century BC, begins not with human pharaohs, but with gods and demigods whose reigns are measured in thousands of years. The transition from divine rule to mortal kingship is marked clearly, just as it is in Sumer. In the Palmo stone, one of Egypt's oldest chronological records, early rulers are listed with reign lengths that gradually decrease from cosmic spans to human lifespans across successive dynasties. The Hindu Puranas describe cycles of time called yugas, the earliest governed by beings whose lifespans stretched across epochs. The Mahabharata records kings of the Satya Yuga living for tens of thousands of years before a great deluge reset the world. Different cultures, different languages, different mythologies, but the same structure. An age of non-human or semi-divine governance, impossibly long reigns, a catastrophic boundary, and then the resumption of rule by beings whose lives fit within recognizable human limits. The Sumerian scribes did not write this as allegory. They copied it from temple archives. They believed contained factual chronologies. They placed these pre-flood kings in the same documentary framework as Gilgamesh of Uruk, whose reign archaeologists have dated to approximately 2700 BC and whose existence is confirmed by building inscriptions and administrative seals. The pre-flood age, as the scribes understood it, was not chaos awaiting order. It was order itself, stable, continuous, and governed by a system that did not require conquest or revolution to sustain itself. If this age was orderly and governed, what system was it operating under? The word Anunnaki appears in administrative tablets centuries before it appears in myths. In the earliest Sumerian records, land surveys, legal judgments, calendar regulations, the Anunnaki are not invoked as distant powers dwelling in cosmic temples. They are named as authorities who allocate territory, settle boundary disputes, and establish the divisions of the agricultural year. The term itself breaks down linguistically as Anunnaki, those of princely seed or offspring of Anu, where Anu represents the concept of sovereign authority, not necessarily a personal deity. In a temple archive from Lagash dating to approximately 2400 BC, a land dispute is resolved with the phrase "by decree of the Anunnaki." The boundary is set at the canal of Lumaganuna, not a prayer, a legal citation. The Anunnaki function here as a governing council whose decisions carry administrative weight recorded in the same tone used to document grain allocations and water rights. Another text from Nepo lists the 50 great Anunnaki as overseers of specific cities and regions. Enki governs Idu and manages freshwater systems. Enlil administers Nipple and regulates the calendar. Ninhasag oversees birth records and population counts. Each name corresponds to a jurisdiction, a function, a domain of responsibility. The language is managerial, not devotional. There are no miracles in these early records, no acts of creation, no moral judgments or divine wrath. The Anunnaki do not demand worship or issue commandments. They allocate, they regulate, they judge disputes according to precedent. When temples are built in their honor, the dedicatory inscriptions describe them not as places of worship, but as administrative centers. Archives where decrees are stored, courts where decisions are rendered, observatories where celestial movements are tracked. By contrast, later Babylonian mythology, composed more than 1,000 years after the earliest administrative texts, transforms these figures into cosmic actors battling primordial chaos, shaping the heavens, and establishing moral order. The Enuma Elish, written around 1200 BC, depicts the Anunnaki as warriors and creators, but this theological layer is absent from the older sources. The earlier texts describe governance, not divinity. The shift is linguistic. In 3rd millennium Sumerian tablets, the verb used with Anunnaki is gar, to place, to establish, to set in order. By the 2nd millennium, Akkadian texts use banu, to create. The function has changed from organization to origin, from administration to theology, but then something interrupts this continuity. The flood is mentioned in 18 separate Mesopotamian sources spanning 2,000 years. In every version, the Anunnaki are present before the catastrophe and conspicuously silent after it. No text describes their destruction. No myth recounts their departure. They simply cease to appear in administrative records after the water recedes. Human kings resume rule. Scribes continue copying the old decrees, but the council that once governed is no longer convened. If this system functioned for ages, what caused it to suddenly end? The flood is not described as divine punishment in the oldest versions of the story. In the Eridu Genesis, the earliest surviving Sumerian flood narrative dating to approximately 1700 BC, the text is fragmentary, airy, but clear in tone. The flood comes not because humanity has sinned, but because the world has become too loud, too populated, too difficult to manage. The decision to send water is framed as administrative necessity, not moral judgment. The language is curatorial. The flood is an interruption, not an ending. Meanwhile, archaeologists excavating Mesopotamian city sites have found exactly what the texts describe. Clean layers of water-deposited silt interrupting continuous occupation debris at Ur, Kish, Shuruppak, and Uruk. The layers date to approximately 2900 BC, aligning with the chronological boundary marked in the king list. Above the silt, settlement resumes immediately, but with differences. At Shuruppak, excavators found that the post-flood city was rebuilt using the same street grid as the pre-flood settlement, but with narrower lanes and smaller buildings, as though constructed by a reduced population working from memory of the earlier layout. At Kish, the temple foundations above the flood layer precisely match the orientation of the structures buried beneath it. At Eridu, the sacred precinct continues in exact alignment across the stratigraphic break. This is not mythological allegory, it is measurable physical evidence of a catastrophic flooding event followed by deliberate structured rebuilding that preserves prior organization. But here is what the texts do not say. They do not describe the Anunnaki returning after the water recedes. In the Eridu Genesis, Zeusra offers sacrifices after the flood, but the gods who receive them are distant, symbolic, no longer governing. In Atrahasis, the survivor is granted immortality and removed from the world, isolated on an island beyond human reach. The administrative council that once regulated cities, water, and time is simply absent from post-flood governance. Human kings resume rule. Scribes copy the old decrees. Temples are rebuilt, but the figures who once presided over them are no longer named in administrative records. They have withdrawn into liturgy, into prayer, into memory. No longer managers, but objects of worship. What happened when the waters receded, and who returned to rule? After the flood, kingship did not begin. It resumed. The Sumerian king list marks the transition with clinical precision. The flood swept over. After the flood had swept over when kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Kish. The phrasing mirrors the opening of the entire document. Kingship descends a second time, not created anew, but transferred once again, as though the office itself had survived the catastrophe, even if its original holders had not. But something fundamental has changed. The first post-flood king, Ga of Kish, rules for 200 years. Still impossible by modern biological standards, but a fraction of the 43,000 years attributed to Alolam. The next king, Gulanidaba Anipapad, rules for 960 years, then Zukakip 900 years. The descent continues across generations 800, 700, 600, until within a few dynasties, reign lengths drop into ranges archaeologists can verify through cross-reference building inscriptions and administrative seals. By the time kingship reaches Uruk around 2700 BC, the reigns are measured in decades. Gilgamesh, whose existence is confirmed by contemporary tablets, rules for 126 years according to the king list. Still extraordinary, but within a framework that suggests exaggerated life expectancy rather than cosmic timescales. The shift is systematic, not random. It follows a curve as though something governing longevity had gradually diminished rather than vanished instantly. Yet the scribes record these changes without commentary, as though documenting a known transition rather than questioning an anomaly. Morielling is the language used to describe post-flood kings. Pre-flood rulers are simply listed by name and duration, but after the waters recede, kings are described by their actions. Who built the wall of Uruk? Who restored the temple of Enlil? Who dug the canal connecting the Euphrates to the Tigris? They are no longer administrators presiding over continuity. They are builders working to recover what was lost. The inscriptions themselves confirm this shift. A foundation tablet from Uramu, king of Ur, around 2100 BC reads, "I restored the temple which had fallen into disrepair since distant days." Another from Shuli, his successor, states, "I returned the rites to their proper order as they were performed in ancient times." The kings do not claim innovation. They claim restoration of a prior state they believe was more correct, more complete, more aligned with an older template. This is inheritance language. Not the language of founders, but of stewards maintaining systems they did not design. Meanwhile, the cities themselves tell another story. Post-flood Uruk is rebuilt on the exact foundations of its pre-flood predecessor. The temple of Inanna rises in the same location, oriented to the same celestial alignments, following the same stepped platform design. At Eridu, 17 successive temple layers preserve identical floor plans across millennia, as though the architecture itself carried instructions that could not be altered. If humans ruled, why did their cities still follow older designs? The cities did not start over, they continued. At Eridu, archaeologists excavating the temple precinct uncovered 17 successive building phases stacked atop one another like geological strata. Each layer represents a reconstruction following decay or flood damage. But here is what should not be possible. Across more than 2,000 years of rebuilding, the floor plan never changes. The same rectangular sanctuary, the same offering platform, the same entrance orientation aligned 15 degrees east of true north. This is not gradual architectural evolution. This is replication. The ziggurat of Ur, built around 2100 BC by King U-Namu, rises in 3 terrace platforms with staircases converging at precise angles. Its corners align to the cardinal directions with an accuracy of less than 1 degree of error, a feat requiring astronomical observation and geometric calculation. Yet Unamu's own foundation inscription states, "He did not design the structure. He restored it according to its original plan," implying the existence of an architectural template predating his reign by centuries. Similarly, the White Temple at Uruk, constructed around 3200 BC, sites atop a massive platform whose base dimensions follow a ratio of 5:3, a proportion that appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian sacred architecture and corresponds to the orbital relationship between Venus and Earth. Whether the builders understood this celestial ratio or simply copied measurements from earlier structures is unclear. What is clear is that they did not experiment. They followed precedent. The irrigation systems present an evener problem. The canal network feeding Sumerian cities required hydrological engineering on a scale that should demand generations of trial and error, calculating gradient flow, preventing silt accumulation, managing seasonal flooding. Yet the earliest canals excavated at Uruk and Lagash show no evidence of failed prototypes or corrected designs. They appear fully functional from their first construction, as though built by engineers who already understood the principles governing water distribution across flatland terrain. A cuneiform tablet from Lagash, dated to approximately 2400 BC, records a boundary dispute resolved by measuring the flow rate of a canal. The calculation uses a mathematical formula. Discharge equals cross-sectional area multiplied by velocity that would not be formally articulated in Western science until the 18th century AD. Yet the Sumerian scribe applies it without explaining its derivation, suggesting it was already standard technical knowledge. At Nippur, the temple archive contained a tablet listing the names of the sacred cities in their proper order. The list matches the geographical arrangement of settlements along the Euphrates from south to north, but adds a detail archaeologists have confirmed through excavation. It records the original foundation dates of each city's temple, some predating the earliest known occupation layers by several centuries. The phrase appears again, "This is the restoration of what was before." If the cities remembered, where did their knowledge come from? Writing does not emerge, it appears. The earliest known ununiform tablets dating to approximately 3200 BC are not primitive experiments in symbolic communication. They record complex transactions, grain storage calculations, land allotments, temple offerings measured in specific units. The script is already standardized with consistent sign forms and grammatical structure. There is no archaeological evidence of a gradual evolutionary phase, no slow transition from pictographs to abstract symbols. The system functions immediately. More troubling is what the writing contains. Mathematical texts from the Old Babylonian period around 1800 BC demonstrate knowledge of the Pythagorean theorem more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras. Astronomical tablets predict lunar eclipses using calculations requiring centuries of continuous observation to develop. Medical texts describe surgical procedures for cataracts and trepanation with procedural precision, as though copied from manuals rather than discovered through practice. The base 60 counting system itself, still embedded in how we measure time and angles, appears without precedent. Its mathematical elegance allows for clean division by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. This is not a system invented by trial and error. It is a system designed for efficiency by someone who already understood its applications. Yet Sumerian scribal schools, the Adaba, taught by rote copying. Students did not learn to innovate. They learned to replicate older tablets. Exactly. Master scribes warned against altering texts, emphasizing preservation over interpretation. One colophon reads, "Written according to its original. Let no one change it." The fear was not ignorance. It was loss, corruption, forgetting. When later scribes referenced the source of their knowledge, they used a recurring phrase, "Copied from ancient tablets. Not discovered, not revealed, copied." But memory fades even when preserved. Over centuries, the meaning behind the formulas eroded while the formulas themselves survived. By the first millennium BC, Babylonian astronomers could still predict eclipses, but no longer explained why their methods worked. The knowledge had become ritual, functionally accurate but conceptually opaque. What happens to an inherited system when its origin is forgotten? The Anunnaki do not die. They simply stop appearing. In administrative texts dating before 2500 BC, they are cited frequently settling disputes, allocating land, regulating water. After 2500 BC, these references decline. By 2000 BC, they appear almost exclusively in religious hymns and prayers, no longer governing, but warped. The shift is linguistic, not catastrophic. Authority transfers quietly from council to king, from decree to ritual. No Mesopotamian text describes their departure. No myth recounts rebellion or exile. They withdraw without explanation, and humanity continues alone. This pattern repeats across unconnected civilizations. In Egypt, the Palamo stone records divine kingship, transitioning to human dynasties after the reign of Horus. In India, the Puranas describe the Satya Yuga, an age governed by Devas, ending abruptly followed by shorter ages ruled by mortals. In Mesoamerica, the Pol Vuh recounts gods creating successive generations of humans, then withdrawing after establishing order, different names, different languages, same structure, divine rule, catastrophic boundary, human stewardship. The gods do not vanish, they recede into symbol. Temples continue to bear their names but no longer function as administrative centers. Rituals preserve gestures whose original purpose has been forgotten. What was once governance becomes liturgy. What was once consultation becomes prayer. Humanity inherits not a world, but a system, and the quiet mounting responsibility of maintaining something it no longer fully understands. If humanity became caretaker of a world, it did not design what was left behind. Human history, as the ancients themselves remembered it, is not a story of origin, but of continuation. The Sumerian king list does not celebrate humanity's ascent from ignorance to order. It records a transfer of authority from one kind of ruler to another. The earliest laws do not describe their own creation. They claim to restore decrees already ancient. The first temples are not innovations. They are restorations of foundations believed to precede human memory, civilization. In this framework is not invented, it is maintained. This distinction matters because it reframes everything we assume about progress. If the ancients saw themselves as inheritors rather than inventors, then their greatest fear was not stagnation. It was forgetting, losing the instructions, corrupting the blueprints, allowing the systems they had received to degrade beyond recognition. That fear explains the obsessive copying of tablets, the warnings against altering texts, the precise replication of architectural plans across millennia. It explains why scribes attributed knowledge to ancient writings rather than claiming personal insight. It explains why post-flood kings described themselves as restorers, not founders. They believed they were stewards of something older and more complete than anything they could create themselves, and perhaps they were right. The irrigation canals that function without failed prototypes, the mathematical systems that appear fully formed, the astronomical predictions requiring centuries of observation recorded as though already known, the base 60 counting embedded in our measurement of time, the ziggurat alignments preserved across endless rebuilding, the administrative language used to describe beings who governed before the flood and then vanished without war, without drama, without explanation. Silence is the final artifact, not the silence of absence, but the silence of withdrawal, of systems continuing after their architects have stepped away, of knowledge functioning long after its origin has been forgotten, of humanity inheriting a world it did not design and slowly, carefully trying not to break what it can no longer fully understand. The question is not whether this inheritance existed. The question is what else we have inherited and whether we still recognize it as such. If civilization was inherited, not invented, what else might history still be remembering quietly beneath our